He threw the bouquet directly at her face. Not dropped it. Not set it down. Threw it, the way a man throws something he's done with, something that disgusted him. And the white roses hit Lydia Hartwell square across the cheek before tumbling to the dirt floor of the church entrance. The crowd went silent for exactly 1 second. Then the laughter started. Lydia stood there, 26 years old, 30 pounds heavier than what this town considered acceptable, wearing a dress that had been let out at the seams just that morning, holding her cheek with one hand while white petals settled around her shoes. Her father was behind her somewhere, already making excuses. Her sister was gone, vanished before sunrise. And somehow, Lydia was the one standing in front of 200 people absorbing the humiliation meant for a woman who hadn't even bothered to show up. If you've ever been the person nobody chose, the backup, the consolation, the one who got the table scraps of someone else's life, then you already know exactly how Lydia Hartwell felt in that moment. If this is your first time watching our channel, hit that subscribe button right now and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single story. And while you're at it, drop a like and tell us in the comments what city or country you're watching from. It genuinely means the world to us to see how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Lydia, standing in that church doorway, with rose petals on her shoes and a town full of people waiting to see what she would do next. The morning had started badly before it started at all. Lydia had been awake since 4, which wasn't unusual. She'd been managing the Hartwell household account since she was 16, quietly, without being asked, and 4 in the morning was when her brain finally stopped pretending it could rest. She'd lain in the narrow bed she'd slept in her whole life and listened to the house breathe around her, her mother's soft snoring through the wall, the wind picking up outside, the creak of floorboards that always settled wrong in cold weather. She hadn't been thinking about the wedding. She'd been thinking about the quarterly payments on the south field and whether her father had remembered to send the letter to the grain broker before the end of the month. He hadn't. She'd written it herself the night before and left it on his desk, where he would find it and assume he'd done it himself, and that was fine. That was how things worked in the Hartwell house. Lydia did the work. Someone else took the credit. Not out of malice, her father wasn't a cruel man, but because the idea that his plain, quiet daughter was the one keeping the family finances from collapsing was something his pride simply couldn't accommodate. She'd heard Vivian's door open around 5. She hadn't thought much of it. Vivian was always up early on important days, excited, restless, needing to do 3 things at once. The wedding wasn't until 11, but Vivian would have been arranging her hair since dawn, trying on earrings, holding different gloves up to the light. That was Vivian. Beautiful, electric Vivian, who walked into a room and made the room rearrange itself around her. Lydia had finally gotten up at 6, dressed in her second-best skirt, and gone downstairs to make coffee. That was when she found the letter on the kitchen table. It was addressed to their father, but it was open. Vivian had left it open deliberately, she realized later, so that whoever found it first would read it, and the news would spread through the house before anyone had to say a word out loud. That was Vivian's way. She hated direct confrontation almost as much as she loved dramatic exits. Lydia had picked it up and read it standing there in the kitchen, still holding her coffee cup. Father, I'm sorry. I cannot marry Ethan Wilder. I cannot marry anyone I do not choose. I have gone to find my own life. Please don't look for me. V. The coffee cup had been very hot in her hand. Lydia had stood there for a long time reading those 4 sentences, and then she'd set the letter back on the table exactly as she'd found it, gone to the window, and looked out at the yard where the horses were already getting restless in the paddock. Her first thought, shamefully, had not been about Vivian. It had been about the grain broker letter, and whether today was going to be the kind of day where nothing got done. Her second thought had been, someone has to tell father before he gets dressed. By 7, the Hartwell house was in controlled chaos, which in practice meant Lydia's father was pacing in circles around the parlor, while her mother sat very still on the settee and made no sound whatsoever, which was her particular style of having a complete collapse. Her younger brother Cal had been sent to check the barn twice for no reason. The housemaid had been asked to make tea, then coffee, then toast, and had made all 3 while nobody ate anything. Chester Hartwell was not a bad man, but he was a man who had built his entire self-understanding around the idea that he was the one who kept things together, and when things came apart, he did not have the tools for it. He paced, and every few minutes he said something that wasn't really a question, but sounded like one. What in the hell was she thinking? And the Wilders are going to want blood and 20 years of good standing in this county. 20 years. And Lydia stood in the doorway with the letter in her hand and waited for him to run down enough to hear her. Pa. He didn't stop pacing. Pa. Louder. He stopped. Looked at her. He had her same coloring. Brown eyes, brown hair going gray, a face that was honest without being beautiful. And for a moment he looked at her the way he never quite looked at her in ordinary times, which was directly. "What do we do?" he said. It wasn't a question. "We go to the church," Lydia said. "We get there before the Wilders do. We tell them ourselves." And then what? She didn't have an answer for that part. She just knew that showing up was always better than hiding, and that the worst thing a Hartwell could do was let the Wilders find out from someone else on their own wedding morning. "Then we figure it out," she said. Her father had nodded, and she'd thought for a moment that he was actually going to thank her for being the steady one, the practical one, the one who always knew what to do when everything was falling apart. Instead, he said, "Go put on your good dress," and turned back to his pacing. Lydia had gone upstairs and put on her good dress. The Wilder family arrived at the church in a wagon that cost more than most families in Clearwater County earned in a year. Lydia had been watching from the side door when they pulled up. Harlan Wilder in front, his back straight as a fence post, wearing a suit that probably came from a tailor in Billings. Ethan beside him, which was the first time Lydia had actually looked at him up close. She'd seen him before, obviously. The county wasn't large, and the Hartwell and Wilder families had been doing careful, suspicious business with each other for years. But she'd mostly seen him from a distance, a tall figure across the yard at the stock sale, or the back of his head in church 3 rows ahead. She'd never had reason to look at him directly, and he'd certainly never had reason to look at her. He was 29. She knew that from the talk. He'd taken over the day-to-day running of the Wilder Ranch 2 years ago when Harlan's health had made the physical work difficult, and the ranch had been struggling ever since in ways that people talked around without saying plainly. The Hartwell-Wilder marriage had been arranged 6 months ago, and everybody understood it was as much about consolidating resources as it was about anything else. Vivian had understood it too, which was probably part of why she'd run. Ethan Wilder stepped down from the wagon and straightened his jacket, and Lydia's first thought was that he looked tired. Not the way a man looks tired after a hard week. The kind of tired that's settled in behind the eyes and doesn't leave when you sleep. Then her father walked out to meet them, holding Vivian's letter in his hand, and Lydia watched Ethan Wilder's face as Chester Hartwell spoke. He didn't look angry. That surprised her. He stood very still, one hand resting on the wagon wheel, and his face did something complicated that Lydia recognized because she did it herself. The careful work of keeping your expression neutral while something painful happened behind it. His father was different. Harlan Wilder's face went red starting from his jaw and spreading upward, and when Chester finished talking, Harlan said something low and sharp that Lydia couldn't hear from where she stood. Whatever it was made her father straighten up and say, loud enough for her to catch, "I will honor the agreement. We will honor it." Then Harlan Wilder looked past Chester Hartwell's shoulder and found Lydia standing in the side doorway. The way he looked at her, the quick scan, top to bottom, the faint curl at one corner of his mouth, was the kind of look that had followed her entire life. The look that said she had already been measured against a standard she didn't meet, and the verdict was in. "That one?" Harlan said. Chester turned, saw Lydia. His face did something she didn't want to analyze. "She's a good girl," her father said. "Capable. She knows how to run a household." "She's not what was agreed to," Harlan said. "No," her father agreed. "But she's what we have." That was when someone in the crowd of gathered townspeople. The ceremony had been scheduled in the church, but half the county had apparently come out to watch the arrival, laughed. Just one person at first, then another. Not cruel exactly, not kind either. Just the sound people make when something unexpected happens and they don't know what else to do with it. Lydia walked out of the doorway and across the yard. She wasn't sure what she intended to do. She hadn't been consulted. No one had asked her. Her father had looked at her and said, "She's what we have," like she was a piece of furniture that might fit the space if you moved it right. She crossed the yard and stood in front of Ethan Wilder. Up close he was taller than she'd thought, and he was looking at her. Actually looking, not the dismissive scan his father had done, but the kind of look where someone is trying to read something they don't yet understand. His eyes were gray, or maybe blue. It was hard to tell in that light. She said, "You don't have to." She hadn't planned to say anything. The words just came out. "You don't have to agree to this," she said. "Whatever they've arranged between them, you don't have to go through with it. Nobody's forcing you." Harlan Wilder made a sound. Her father made a sound. The crowd made several sounds. Ethan looked at her for another moment, and she had the strange feeling that she'd said something he hadn't expected from anyone, which was maybe the most interesting thing that had happened to him all morning. Then he said, "I'll marry her." And the world went sideways. The minister was flustered. The witnesses had to be reorganized. 3 women in the crowd started talking all at once and didn't stop. Chester Hartwell shook Harlan Wilder's hand with the desperate gratitude of a man who had just been pulled back from a very tall edge. Lydia stood in the church and watched all of this happen around her without being consulted, without being asked, without anyone pausing to wonder whether she had any feelings about it at all, and she thought, this is the same as always, just bigger. The ceremony was brief and strange. The minister rushed through the words. Ethan stood beside her and said the right things at the right times, and she said the right things back, and nobody looked at the door where Vivian was supposed to be standing, and nobody mentioned the flowers that had been arranged for a different bride. And when it was over, Ethan Wilder's hand was brief and correct around hers for exactly as long as the handshake required, and then released. His father didn't speak to Lydia once. Her own father hugged her, too tight, for too long, and she felt in it the particular guilt of a man who knows he's used someone he loves. The crowd drifted away. The wagon was brought around, and Lydia Hartwell, Lydia Wilder, now, she supposed, climbed up onto the seat beside a man she did not know and let the horses carry them both away from everything she had ever called home. They rode for 2 hours without speaking. This was not as uncomfortable as it might have been, because Lydia had lived most of her life in rooms where silence was the default. She was used to filling quiet spaces with her own thoughts instead of words. And apparently Ethan Wilder was used to it too, because he drove without any apparent need to fill the air with sound, and the horses moved, and the land moved past them, and the mountains sat in the distance being large and indifferent. At some point he said, "I should tell you what you're coming into." "All right," she said, "the ranch is not in good condition." He kept his eyes on the road. "Financially, we've had 2 bad years with the cattle. There are debts I haven't been able to address. My father knows it's struggling, but he doesn't know the specific numbers, and I'd prefer it stayed that way." Lydia absorbed this. "How bad?" "Bad enough that if the next year doesn't improve, I'll have to start selling acreage." She nodded, thinking about the numbers. She couldn't help it. Her brain automatically started sorting through what she knew about cattle prices and what she'd read about the territory's growing markets, and what that implied about the kinds of contracts the Wilder Ranch was probably carrying. "Do you have the ledgers at the house?" she asked. He looked at her then, briefly. "Yes." "I'd like to look at them." Another pause. "Why?" "Because you told me it was bad, but you haven't told me the specific numbers. I'm better with numbers than with most things." He turned back to the road. Didn't say anything for a while. Then, quietly, "All right." The Wilder Ranch came into view as the afternoon light was shifting. Long shadows, golden edges, the particular beauty of the frontier at the end of a day. Lydia looked at it without romanticism. It was a working operation, and it looked like one. The buildings were large but worn. The fence lines needed attention. The yard had the specific disorder of a place where the work outpaced the people doing it. She cataloged it without thinking, the way she always cataloged everything. What was there, what was missing, what it would take to close the gap. Ethan unhitched the wagon. A ranch hand she hadn't met appeared to take the horses. Nobody greeted her. Nobody showed her around. Ethan carried her single trunk inside and set it at the bottom of the stairs, and then looked at it for a moment like he was working something out. "There's a room made up at the end of the hall," he said. "It's the one that was—" He stopped. "It's the largest room. You can have it." "That's fine," she said. "I'm in the room across." "That's fine too." He nodded. He seemed to want to say something else, but whatever it was, he didn't find it. He put his hat back on and went back outside to the yard. Lydia picked up her own trunk. It wasn't as heavy as it looked, and carried it upstairs. The room at the end of the hall still smelled faintly of the rose water someone had spritzed into the curtains. There were fresh flowers on the table that had already started to turn. A quilt had been folded at the foot of the bed with obvious care. Someone had arranged everything beautifully for a woman who was never going to walk through the door. Lydia set her trunk down, looked at the flowers, looked at the quilt. Then she unpacked her things, her practical skirts, her ledger paper, her 2 books, her mother's worn reading glasses that she'd borrowed and never returned. And she made the room hers in the way she made every space hers, which was without ceremony and without decoration, just by being steady inside it. Through the window, she could hear Ethan moving in the yard below, talking to the ranch hand in short sentences about the horses, the fence on the east side, something about a water line. The voice of a man who kept going even when he was exhausted. She recognized that too. She sat on the edge of the bed that had been made up for Vivian, with Vivian's comfort in mind, for a wedding night that had never happened. And she looked at her own hands in the fading light. She's what we have. She'd heard worse. She'd told herself worse. She got up, went downstairs, and found the kitchen. Nobody had thought to start dinner. She started dinner. And outside, in the yard that would soon be as familiar to her as her own heartbeat, the man she had married without being asked went on working in the dusk, and neither of them knew yet what the other one was. But the ledgers were in the study, and tomorrow she was going to read them. And that, as it turned out, was where everything would begin. The ledgers were worse than he'd said. Lydia had found them exactly where Ethan told her they'd be. The bottom drawer of the desk in the study, stacked in no particular order, held together in some cases by a length of twine that had gone brittle with age. She'd carried them to the kitchen table because the study had no good lamp, and she'd sat down with a cup of coffee that went cold before she remembered to drink it, and she'd read. It took her most of that first night. By the time the sky outside the kitchen window started going from black to the particular gray-purple that meant 4 in the morning, she had filled 6 pages of her own paper with notes, and her stomach had settled into the particular low feeling she got when numbers told her a story nobody wanted to hear. The Wilder Ranch was not simply struggling, it was bleeding, not dramatically, not the kind of bleeding that happens all at once and shocks everyone into action, the slower kind. The kind where a little goes out every month for years, and nobody notices because each individual loss seems manageable, seems like just the cost of doing business, seems like something that will correct itself next season when the cattle prices come up, or the winter is shorter, or the luck turns. The kind of bleeding that only becomes visible when someone sits down and adds up all the small numbers and finds a very large number hiding inside them. Ethan had been paying 3 separate buyers for transport and processing, each of whom had negotiated individually over the years, none of whom knew about the others. Lydia did the arithmetic and found that he was paying, on average, 22% more per head than the going rate in the territory. Not because anyone had cheated him, the contracts were legal, the rates written down, but because nobody had ever sat down with all 3 contracts at the same time and compared them. There were 2 grazing leases on land the ranch hadn't actively used in 4 years, still paying, every month. There was a loan from a bank in Billings at an interest rate that had been acceptable in 1879 and was punishing now, in 1883, because rates had shifted and nobody had renegotiated. There was a feed supplier contract that had an automatic renewal clause buried in the 3rd page, which had been renewing every year at a rate 5% higher than the previous year, compounding. The original contract had been signed when Harlan Wilder was running the operation. Lydia doubted Ethan even knew it existed. She sat with all of this for a while, her pen making small marks in the margins of her notes. Then she got up and made fresh coffee, and she stood at the kitchen window and watched the yard begin to emerge from the dark. And she thought carefully about what she was going to say and how she was going to say it, because she had learned a long time ago that there was a right way and a wrong way to tell a person that their house is on fire. Ethan was already in the yard when she went out. He had a fence board in one hand and a hammer in the other, and he was fixing the section on the north side that she'd noticed was sagging when they'd arrived. The sun wasn't fully up yet. He worked the way she'd heard him work the night before, methodically, without wasted motion, the kind of physical competence that comes from years of necessity rather than preference. He looked up when she crossed the yard. He'd clearly been out here long enough that the cold had reddened the back of his neck. "Morning," he said. "Morning." She stopped a few feet away, hands in her apron pockets. "I went through the ledgers last night." He drove a nail. Didn't look at her. "And?" There are some things I'd like to discuss with you. How bad? She considered softening it, then decided that would be condescending, and that she didn't know him well enough to know whether he preferred his bad news cushioned or plain, but that she herself had always preferred plain and would offer him the same respect. The interest on the Billings loan has cost you approximately $340 more than it should have over the past 2 years, based on current rates. The feed contract has an auto-renewal clause you may not have been aware of, and it's been compounding annually. The 3 transport contracts, combined, are running you about $200 over market rate per season. She paused. That's before we talk about the grazing leases. The hammer stopped. Ethan straightened up slowly. He turned to look at her properly, which he hadn't done yet this morning, and she could see him doing the quick mental arithmetic, or trying to, and finding the numbers were larger than he'd expected, and that the thing he'd told himself was a bad situation was in fact a worse one than he'd allowed himself to know. You got all that from one night with the ledgers, he said. It wasn't quite a question. I've been doing my family's accounts since I was 16, she said. I'm fast. He looked at her for another moment. Then he put the hammer down on the fence rail and said, All right, show me. They sat at the kitchen table for 2 hours. It was uncomfortable at first, not hostile, just the particular discomfort of 2 strangers suddenly required to share not just a table, but a problem, which is more intimate than most people realize. Ethan sat across from her with his hands wrapped around his coffee cup and read the notes she'd made, and she watched his face and tried to gauge what he was thinking, which was difficult because his face was not easy to read. He'd clearly had practice keeping it still. The feed contract, he said at one point. My father signed that. In 1877, you would have been 23. He set the page down. I didn't know about the renewal clause. Most people don't read past the first page of a contract, she said. That's why it's buried in the third. That's not an excuse. No, it's just true. He looked at the page again. Something moved through his expression. Not quite anger, not quite shame, something between the two that was its own particular feeling that people get when they realize the floor is lower than they thought it was. What can be fixed, he said. She pulled her notes closer. The transport contracts can be renegotiated. I'd recommend approaching all 3 buyers within the same week, separately, and letting each of them know, truthfully, that you're reviewing your contracts. You don't have to tell them about the others. The competition is implicit. In my experience, that's usually enough to get a better rate. You've done that before. With grain buyers. Same principle. He nodded slowly. The loan. The loan is the most urgent thing. There's a bank in Helena that's been offering better rates for agricultural operations. I've read about it. I follow the territorial business reports when I can get them. She could see a slight shift in his expression at that, and she resisted the urge to apologize for it, which was something she'd spent years doing, apologizing for knowing things. I can write the inquiry letter if you want. You'd have to sign it. Why would you write it? Because I'm better at it than most people, she said, and because it benefits both of us if the ranch is solvent. The word both sat in the air between them for a moment. It was the first time either of them had used a word that implied they were on the same side of anything. Ethan picked up his coffee cup, found it empty, and put it down again. He looked at her across the table, really looked, the way he'd looked at her the day before in the churchyard, that reading look, and she sat still under it because she'd learned that the right response to being seen clearly was to let it happen. All right, he said again. Write the letter. She wrote 3 letters that afternoon. The inquiry to the Helena Bank, a notice to the company holding the 2 unused grazing leases, requesting confirmation of current terms and signaling intent to review, and a brief, politely worded request to the feed supplier for documentation of all renewal notices, worded carefully enough that it would make them nervous without being threatening. She left them on the desk in the study for Ethan to read before he signed. He came in from the yard at dusk, read all 3 standing up without sitting down, made no changes to any of them, and signed his name at the bottom of each one. He handed them back to her. You wrote these the way a lawyer would, he said. My father had a lawyer in Cheyenne who let me read his correspondence once, when I was 19. He said I asked too many questions. She folded the letters carefully. I took that as a compliment. Ethan almost smiled at that. Almost. The corner of his mouth moved and then stopped, like a man who'd learned somewhere along the way to be careful with things like smiling. I'll ride to town tomorrow and post them, he said. I can go. I'll go. It wasn't hostile, just definite. She understood it. He was still working out what she was, and how much of his operation to let her into, and she was patient enough to let him take the time to work it out. She'd been patient her whole life. One more season of it was manageable. The ranch hand's name was Percy, and he'd been with the Wilder operation for 6 years. He was 40-something, broad through the shoulders, with a face that had been weathered into something like permanent skepticism. He did not introduce himself to Lydia for 3 days. He simply looked at her each morning with a flatness that she'd seen on animals that had learned to distrust new things, and went about his work. On the 4th morning, she brought him coffee without being asked. He looked at it, looked at her, drank it without a word. On the 5th morning, he said, "The fence on the south quarter needs 6 new posts." "I know," she said. "I saw it when I walked the property yesterday." He squinted at her. "You walked the whole property." "I wanted to understand what we were working with." Another long squint. "We don't have the timber for 6 posts right now." "I know. I priced it this morning. If we order from Miller's Yard in town, it'll run about $4. I found $4 in the petty account that's been sitting unused." Percy looked at her for a long moment. "Huh," he said. That was all. But he drank the coffee, and the next morning he said good morning first, which she took as the frontier equivalent of a formal apology for the previous days. The second week brought rain that turned the yard into a slow brown problem, and a letter from the Helena Bank expressing interest in discussing refinancing terms, which arrived faster than Lydia had expected and made Ethan go very still when he read it. "That was fast," he said. "I included the property assessment figures and the cattle count projections," she said. "Banks respond faster when you give them the numbers up front instead of making them ask." He was still reading. "Where did you get the cattle count projections?" "Percy." Ethan looked up. "Percy doesn't talk to anyone." "He talks to me," she said. "I bring coffee." This time the almost smile got a little further. He folded the letter and tucked it into his jacket pocket, and she noticed he kept his hand over it for a second before he let it go. She understood that. A letter like that, the first sign of movement after a long time of nothing but sinking, was the kind of thing you wanted to feel in your hand for a moment before it became just a piece of paper again. The third week, Harla and Wilder came to visit. He rode in on a Wednesday morning without warning, which Lydia had the feeling was deliberate. He tied his horse at the post and came into the yard and stood there until Ethan came out of the barn, and the two of them had a conversation by the fence that went on for 20 minutes while Lydia finished making bread in the kitchen. She couldn't hear the words. She could hear the shape of the voices, Harlan's insistent and rising, Ethan's low and controlled. And she knew, without needing to hear the specific words, that she was the subject of some part of it. Harlan came inside after. She hadn't invited him, but she hadn't locked the door either. He stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the room. The clean table, the organized shelves, the drying herbs she'd hung from the beam because they'd been growing wild and useful in the yard, and she couldn't see a reason to waste them. And his expression was the one she'd seen on him since the first day. Not hostile exactly. Assessing. "You've been changing things," he said. "I've been organizing things," she said. "There's a difference." He moved to the table and looked at the papers she'd been working on. The feed contract analysis, the buyer comparison spreadsheet. He didn't ask permission to look. She didn't tell him to stop. "You did these," he said. "Yes." "Ethan said you'd been looking at the accounts." "Yes." Harlan was quiet for a moment, which was a different quality of quiet than Ethan's. Ethan's silence was thoughtful. His father's was more like a tool he used, a way of pressing on a situation to see how it responded. "My son's finances are his own business," Harlan said finally. "That's right," Lydia agreed. "They are." The implication sat between them, tidy and unmistakable. Harlan looked at her directly for the first time since the church, and she met it without looking away, which she could see surprised him. He left without drinking the coffee she hadn't offered him. Ethan came in 10 minutes later and sat down at the table without speaking. He looked tired in the way she'd noticed before, the deeper kind. But there was something else now underneath it, something like someone who'd been braced for a blow that landed differently than expected. "What did he say to you?" Ethan asked. "Nothing important." "Lydia." She looked at him. It was the first time he'd used her name, and the way he said it surprised her. Not like a courtesy, but like someone who meant the specific person. He said your finances are your own business, she said. Ethan's jaw moved. That's what he said to me too, verbatim. He's not a man who varies his message. I know the type. A pause. I'm sorry he came here. You don't need to apologize for your father. He didn't have to be rude. He wasn't rude to me, she said. He was assessing me. There's a difference. She picked her pen back up. I think I passed. Barely. Ethan looked at her. Then he said, almost to himself, You're not what I expected. She didn't ask what he'd expected. She already knew. Quiet and manageable and grateful for whatever she was given, content to stay in the background, no opinions about the feed contract. She'd spent her whole life being not what people expected, and she'd learned that the right response to it was just to keep going and let time do the explaining. I'll have the buyer comparison ready by Friday, she said. You can decide which two to approach first. He nodded. I didn't leave right away, though. He sat there for a moment longer, and she worked, and the rain picked up against the window. And it was the first time the silence between them felt less like a wall and more like something else. Something that didn't have a name yet, but that wasn't distance. The month turned. She rode into Clearwater twice for supplies, and both times she felt the town's eyes on her. The first time it was just curiosity. The woman who'd replaced her own sister at the altar, come to the general store in a plain skirt with a shopping list in her hand. Nothing remarkable about her except the story attached to her name. The second time it was different. Mrs. Aldrich at the post office said something careful and kind about how the Wilder Ranch was lucky to have a sensible woman running the household. The tone suggested she'd heard something, that things were improving out there maybe, or that the new wife wasn't the disaster everyone had expected. Lydia thanked her and bought her stamps and didn't say much, but she felt it on the ride home. That small, careful thing that she'd learned not to trust too quickly, the possibility of belonging. Back at the ranch, Ethan had started leaving the study door open when he worked in there in the evenings. She wasn't sure when that had started. She noticed it one night when she was carrying laundry past, and she could see him at the desk, lamp burning, the Helena Bank letter open in front of him, and a new letter he was drafting beside it. He'd written to the transport buyers that week. She'd helped him frame the language. And two of the three had already responded. The first had offered a reduction of 8%. The second had offered 12%. The third hadn't responded yet, but Ethan had told her, with the particular flatness of a man understating something that pleased him, that 12% was more than he'd hoped for. It's a start, she'd said. It's a start, he'd agreed. It was Percy who told her about the Eastfield water problem. They were out by the south fence on a Thursday morning, checking the new posts, and he mentioned it the way he mentioned most things, sideways, like he was talking about something else. Eastfield's been running low since August, he said. Cattle don't like it down there anymore. Water source might be compromised. Compromised how? Could be the creeks shifting, could be something upstream, hard to say without checking. Has anyone checked? Percy gave her the squint that she now understood meant, you're asking me why something wasn't done, and the answer is complicated. Ethan rode out there in September, he said he'd look into it. Then the cattle prices dropped and the feed contract renewal came due, and I think it got set aside. This was how things collapsed, Lydia thought, not in dramatic moments, in the accumulation of things set aside. I'll look at it tomorrow, she said. Percy looked at her. It's a 2-hour ride each way. I know, I've got good boots. He almost smiled. Almost. But she went out to the Eastfield the next morning before Ethan was up, which she hadn't planned. She'd intended to tell him, to suggest they go together. But she woke at 4 with the problem turning over in her head, and by 5 she'd decided that waiting was just putting off something that needed seeing. The ride was longer than 2 hours, closer to 3, because the trail needed picking through carefully in 2 places where the rains had made it soft. She got there as the light was going gold and low, and she stood at the edge of the Eastfield and looked at the creek. The water was low, but that wasn't the only problem. About 100 yards upstream, half hidden by the scrub brush that had grown up along the bank, there was a berm. Recent, not this year, but not more than 2 or 3. Built up from the soil, reinforced with rock, deliberately constructed to redirect the creek's flow away from the field and toward the north. She stood there for a long time looking at it. Then she looked north. toward where the flow was being directed. The property line was marked by a fence. On the other side of the fence, visible in the distance, was the northeast corner of a neighboring operation. She wasn't certain whose. She rode home with the information sitting in her chest like a stone, because she'd seen enough of her father's business dealings to know that a deliberately built berm redirecting water from someone's land was not a natural problem. It was a decision. Someone had made it. Ethan was in the yard when she rode in. He'd clearly been looking for her. "Where were you?" he said, not angry, or not only angry. The other thing under it was something more like fear, which she filed away and didn't comment on. "Eastfield," she said, "the water problem. You went out there alone without telling me." "I should have told you. I'm sorry." She meant it. "I woke up thinking about it, and I went." He stood there with something working in his face. Then, "What did you find?" She told him. The change in his expression was not subtle. Something went hard around his eyes, and he turned away from her for a moment and looked at the fence line on the south side of the yard, and she watched his hands close into fists and then deliberately open again. "Hargrove," he said. "Who's Hargrove?" "Dale Hargrove. He runs the operation north of our east field." Ethan turned back to her. "We've had disagreement about the property line before. My father handled it the last time. I didn't know it had gotten to this." This being someone building a berm on or near a property line to redirect a water source. "Is the berm on your land?" she asked. "I don't know. I'd have to check the survey." "Do you have the survey documents?" "Somewhere." She nodded. "Find them tonight. I'll look at them." He was quiet for a moment, looking at her. Then he said, "You rode 3 hours alone to look at a creek." 2.5, she said. "The trail was passable in the second section." "That's not—" He stopped, started again. "You didn't have to do that." "I know," she said. "I wanted to understand the property. I told you that the first night." "You said you wanted to look at the ledgers." "The property is a ledger," she said. "It's just a different kind." He looked at her with that reading expression again, and this time she looked back without looking away. And whatever he found there seemed to settle something in him, some question he'd been carrying around unanswered. "I'll find the survey," he said. He found it that evening. She sat at the kitchen table with him until nearly midnight, both of them bent over the survey documents and the rough map she'd drawn from memory of what she'd seen at the creek. And by the end of it, they'd established 2 things. The first thing was that the berm was built within 4 feet of the property line, possibly on Hargrove's side, possibly on Ethan's, and the survey was old enough and imprecise enough in that section that it wasn't definitive. The second thing was that it didn't matter, legally, which side the berm was on. What mattered was the water rights. And those, according to a territorial water allocation document that had been filed with the county in 1878, and that Lydia had found tucked inside the survey folder, apparently forgotten, gave the Wilder Ranch prior claim to the creek's flow in that section. She set the document on the table. Ethan read it. He read it again. "My father filed this," he said, "in 1878, before Hargrove started his operation, which means the water right predates Hargrove's claim by at least 4 years." The silence in the kitchen was a different quality now. Still late, still the lamp burning low, still the 2 of them at a table with papers between them. But the situation inside the silence had changed shape entirely. "This is a legal document," Ethan said. "It is. If we take this to the county recorder, Hargrove would have to remove the berm," she said, "or pay damages for the period the water's been diverted. Probably both, if you wanted to push it." She paused. "I'm not a lawyer, but I know how to read a document, and that document says what it says." Ethan sat back in his chair. He put his hands on the table and looked at the document and then looked at her. "How did you know to look in the survey folder?" he said. "I look in every folder," she said. "That's the job." Another long silence. The lamp flickered once. Outside, the wind was picking up again. "Lydia," he said. "Yes." "I need to ask you something." She waited. "When you agreed to this, when you said you didn't have to, at the church." He stopped, tried again. "What made you stay after you said that?" She thought about it honestly because he was asking honestly, and because she was tired enough that dishonesty would have taken more effort than she had. "I didn't decide to stay," she said. "I decided not to run. There's a difference." He looked at her. "Vivian ran," Lydia said. She ran because she wanted her own life, and I can't say she was wrong. But running has always seemed to me like you're telling the situation it won. I don't like losing. She folded her hands on the table. And the ledgers were a mess. I couldn't leave a mess. He didn't say anything for a moment. I'm glad you didn't leave the mess, he said finally. It was not a declaration of anything. It was just true, said plainly by a man who was working out how to be true. She took it for what it was. Get some sleep, she said. Tomorrow we should ride out together and document the berm. You'll want a witness. He nodded. He gathered the papers carefully, the water rights document on top, and he took them to the study. She put out the lamp and went upstairs, and she lay in the bed that had been made up for her sister and looked at the ceiling in the dark. And she did not let herself feel hopeful, because hope had been a luxury she'd learned to handle carefully. Too much of it at once, and it became the kind of thing that could hurt you when it didn't pan out. But she let herself feel, just briefly, that she was in the right place, that this particular mess, the accounts, the contracts, the water rights, the slow unraveling of a ranch that still had the bones of something good, was hers to fix. Not because anyone had asked her to, not because she had no choice, because she was good at it, and because the work was real, and because the man sleeping across the hall had looked at her today like she was a person whose presence in his life was beginning to make a particular kind of sense. That was enough. For tonight, that was enough. She turned onto her side and closed her eyes. And outside the wind moved across the Montana dark, and the ranch held its ground the way it had always held its ground. Imperfectly, stubbornly, refusing to go under, just like her. The Hargrove matter went to the county recorder on a Thursday, and by Friday afternoon the word had spread the way things always spread in Clearwater, quietly, then all at once. Lydia hadn't intended it to be public. She and Ethan had ridden to the county office together with the water rights document and the survey notes and the rough sketches she'd made of the berm's position relative to the property line, and the recorder, a deliberate, careful man named Foster, who wore the same gray vest every day and took his time with everything, had looked at the documentation for a long time before he'd said, with the flatness of someone who was trying not to have an opinion out loud, that the Wilder claim appeared to be well supported. He would contact Hargrove, he said. He would require a response within 30 days. If the berm was not addressed, the county would refer the matter to the Territorial Land Office. They rode home. That was all. But Foster had a wife who talked to the woman at the feed store, and the woman at the feed store talked to everyone, and by the following Monday there were people in Clearwater who knew that the new Wilder wife had found a 6-year-old water rights document that her husband's own father had apparently forgotten about, and that she'd used it to back Dale Hargrove into a corner he couldn't get out of without losing something. Hargrove was not well liked. He ran his operation hard and his workers harder, and there had been 2 other property disputes in the county that people remembered, both of which had gone sideways in ways that left a bad feeling. The fact that someone had finally pushed back on him, and that the someone was a quiet, plain-looking woman who'd arrived in the county under the most embarrassing circumstances possible, was the kind of story that Clearwater couldn't help enjoying. Lydia heard about it secondhand from Percy, who mentioned it with the careful neutrality of a man who was actually pleased. People are talking, he said. I know, she said. Mostly good things. That'll change, she said, not bitterly, just from experience. Give it time. Percy looked at her. You always do that, he said. Do what? Wait for the floor to drop. She thought about that. Old habit. Might be worth breaking, he said, and went back to the fence work. She stood there for a moment after he'd gone, in the yard with the morning cold still sharp around her, and she thought that Percy had turned out to be a person worth knowing, which was something she hadn't expected and which she was learning to notice. The small, unexpected things that turned out to be better than anticipated. She was still learning to let them count. Hargrove sent a letter at the end of the 30 days. He did not admit to anything. He agreed, in language that his lawyer had clearly written, to a voluntary modification of the water management structure on his property, effective the following spring, in the interests of maintaining productive relations between neighboring operations. He did not use the word berm. He did not use the word diversion. He did not apologize. Ethan read the letter standing at the kitchen table and then set it down without expression. He's going to hate us now, he said. He already didn't like you, Lydia said. Now he just has a specific reason. That's worse. Or it's cleaner. She poured him coffee. Before, he was redirecting your water and you didn't know why or whether it was deliberate. Now you both know where you stand. That's actually easier to manage. Ethan picked up the coffee and looked at her across the rim of the cup. You think about things differently than anyone I've ever met, he said. Is that a complaint? No. He drank. It's just true. The cattle sale in November was the first real test. Ethan had worked with Percy on the selection, which animals to bring, which to hold back, how to present the herd to get the best assessment. Lydia had done something different. She'd written ahead to 2 buyers who weren't the 3 they'd always used. Buyers from outside the county, from operations further east who were looking for a reliable Montana supplier and hadn't found one they trusted yet. She'd described the herd honestly, with numbers and condition assessments that Percy had helped her verify, and she'd invited them to attend the sale as observers with the option to negotiate directly afterward. Ethan had read her letters before she sent them. He'd been quiet for a long while. You're trying to create competition at the sale, he said. I'm trying to make sure you have options, she said. There's a difference. If the regular buyers find out I've invited outside parties, then they'll know you're not locked into their rates, she said, which is true, which they should know. He'd looked at her with that particular expression she'd come to recognize, the one where he was deciding whether to push back or whether she'd already outpaced whatever argument he was assembling. And then he'd nodded. Both outside buyers came. The regular buyers noticed. The bidding went higher than it had gone in 3 years. Not dramatically. This wasn't a story where everything turned around in a single afternoon, but noticeably, meaningfully, in a way that showed up in the final numbers as real money rather than theoretical improvement. On the ride home, Ethan said nothing for the first half hour. She'd learned not to fill his silences. He processed things slowly and completely, and interrupting that process was like pulling bread from the oven before it was done. Finally, he said, the difference in the final price was about what we'd have made on an extra 40 head. 43, she said. I did the math on the way back. He glanced at her sideways. 43. Yes. Another silence. Then, thank you. It was the first time he'd said it directly, without it being attached to anything else or softened by qualification. Just those 2 words, plainly given, and she received them the same way, without deflection, without the automatic dismissal she'd spent years reaching for. You're welcome, she said. The winter came down hard in December. 3 weeks of cold that kept everyone close to the buildings, running the animals through rotation to keep them from standing still too long in the freeze. Percy worked until his hands cracked, and Lydia wrapped them in the evenings with the salve her mother had taught her to make from tallow and dried herbs. And Percy accepted this without comment, because accepting things without comment was his primary mode of being. Ethan worked alongside Percy during the worst of it. Physical work, the kind that left him exhausted in a way that showed in his shoulders and his eyes. And Lydia ran the household and the accounts and went over the Helena Bank correspondence, and on the nights when the cold was sharp enough to make the walls creak, made soup from whatever she could put together and left it on the stove where anyone who came in from the cold could find it. It was in December that she discovered the other problem. She'd been going through Ethan's father's older correspondence, not to pry, but because Ethan had told her the filing cabinet in the back room was mostly old Harlan material, and she should sort it as she saw fit. She'd been working through it systematically on evenings when there was nothing more pressing, separating what was relevant from what could be archived. And on a Tuesday night in the second week of December, she found a letter from 1876 that made her read it twice, then a third time, and then get up and make tea. She didn't drink and come back and read it again. It was a letter from Harlan Wilder to a land agent in Helena. Routine on its surface, discussing the boundaries of the Wilder property, the acreage figures, the original territorial grant. But in the third paragraph, there was a number that didn't match the survey documents she'd been working from. The acreage figure Harlan cited in this letter was smaller, by about 40 acres, than the figure on the current survey. 40 acres. In the current land market, depending on the quality, that was anywhere from $200 to $800 of land that was either being counted twice or not at all. She sat with the letter for a long time. The discrepancy could be innocent. Surveys in the territory had been notoriously inconsistent in the early years, and figures changed as measuring improved. It could be a simple clerical error that had propagated through the records, or it could be something else. She didn't tell Ethan that night. She needed to understand it better before she brought it to him, because she'd learned that bringing a man half a problem was sometimes worse than bringing him the whole one. She spent the next 4 days going through everything: the original territorial grant document, the survey, Harlan's correspondence, the county tax record she'd requested copies of from Foster at the county office under the guise of verifying the water rights filing. She cross-referenced figures, drew timelines, and by Saturday she had a picture that was not complete but was complete enough. The 40 acres were real. They were a section of the South Ridge that had been included in the original territorial grant but had somehow dropped out of the active property description somewhere between 1876 and 1880. The current survey, which Ethan had been working from, simply didn't include them. Whether this was error or intention, she couldn't determine from the documents alone, but she could determine that if those 40 acres were legitimately part of the Wilder grant, they were currently listed on the county rolls as unassigned, which meant no one was paying tax on them, no one was claiming them, and they were sitting there in a kind of administrative limbo, waiting for someone to notice. She told Ethan on Saturday evening. She sat him down at the kitchen table and laid out everything in order: the 1876 letter, the survey discrepancy, the tax roll status, her timeline, and walked him through it piece by piece, the way she'd have explained it to her father or to a business associate, factual and clear, watching his face. He didn't say anything for a long time after she finished. "South Ridge," he said finally. "Yes. The grazing there is—" He stopped. "That's good land, Lydia. If those 40 acres are ours, they may be. I can't confirm it from the documents I have. You'd need a surveyor and probably a land attorney to review the original grant. That costs money. Less money than the 40 acres would be worth," she said. He looked at the documents, then at her. "How did you find this?" "I was sorting the filing cabinet." "You were sorting a filing cabinet that's been sitting in that back room for 7 years, and you found a letter that changes the property count." "I read everything," she said. "That's just what I do." He leaned back in his chair and put his hand over his eyes for a moment. Not despair, she'd learned to read the difference. More the gesture of a man who was recalibrating something fundamental. "My father knew about this room," Ethan said. "Yes." "He's been over this property 100 times." "Yes." A pause. "So either he didn't find it, or—" He didn't finish the sentence. She didn't finish it for him. Some things needed to be picked up and turned over privately before they could be said out loud. "Get the surveyor," she said. "Let's find out what's actually there before we decide what it means." He nodded slowly. "Lydia." His voice had gone quieter. "What you've done for this ranch in 3 months, the contracts, the water rights, the buyers at the sale, and now this—" "Don't," she said. "I'm trying to say something." "I know, but don't say it yet." She gathered the documents into a neat stack. "Wait until we know what the South Ridge is worth. Then say it." He was quiet. Then, unexpectedly, he did something she hadn't seen him do before. He smiled, not the careful, almost smile, but actually, with his eyes involved, and it changed his face into something she hadn't been prepared for. She looked back down at the documents. "Go to sleep," she said. "It's late." She did not sleep well that night. Not because of the South Ridge, and not because of anything she could name precisely. It was more the particular sleeplessness that comes when something is shifting, and you can feel the shift but you can't see yet where it's going, and the uncertainty of it keeps pulling you back from the edge of rest. She lay in the bed and listened to the wind and thought about the 40 acres and the filing cabinet and the way Ethan's face had looked when he smiled, and she thought about her sister, which she hadn't let herself do in weeks. She wondered where Vivian was. She hoped she was warm. She hoped genuinely and without bitterness that Vivian had found whatever it was she'd run toward, because running from a life you didn't choose was different from running toward one you did, and Vivian had always been the kind of person who needed to choose. Lydia was not that kind of person. She needed something different. Not the choosing, but the fixing. The finding of things that were broken and making them less broken. It wasn't romantic, what she needed, but it was real. She'd been finding that here. January brought 2 things, the surveyor and Vivian. The surveyor came first. His name was Aldous Beach, and he was a spare, deliberate man who spent 3 days on the South Ridge in February cold without appearing to register the temperature, And when he came back, he presented Ethan with a report that confirmed, with measurements that could hold up to any legal challenge, that the 40 acres on the South Ridge were within the boundaries of the original territorial grant. They were Ethan's. The filing with the county to formally restore them to the active property description took 6 weeks and cost $42, which Lydia had budgeted for already. The 40 acres were good grazing land, as Ethan had said, enough to support an additional 20 to 30 head per season, which translated, at current prices, to meaningful income. Not a transformation, not a salvation, just the next solid thing added to the other solid things, all of it slowly accumulating into the shape of a ranch. She was in the yard on the day the county confirmation came, hanging laundry in the cold because the cold made things dry faster than people assumed, when Ethan came out of the house with the letter in his hand and held it out to her without speaking. She read it, handed it back. $42 in 6 weeks, she said. For 40 acres, he said. Yes. He looked at the letter, then at the land stretching out beyond the fence, and she watched his face do the thing it did when something was settling into place, the slight easing around the eyes, the way his shoulders dropped a fraction. Now, he said, I want to say the thing I was going to say. She kept her hands on the laundry. All right. What you've done here, he stopped, started again, more carefully. I asked you what made you stay back in November. You said you didn't like losing, but I think... Another stop. He was not a man who spoke easily about anything internal, and she could hear him choosing each word like he was picking his way across ice. I think there's more to it than that. I think you work the way you work because you see things other people don't see. Not just numbers. Things. He looked at her. I don't know what I would be looking at right now if you hadn't come here. I don't know what shape this place would be in, and I know that you didn't choose any of this, and I know that's not a small thing to have accepted. So I'm saying thank you, for real, not just for the 40 acres. She had kept her hands on the laundry all through this, and she kept them there now because she needed something to do with them while she absorbed what he'd said. You chose it too, she said finally. You said yes at the church when you didn't have to. I know why I said yes, he said. I'm still not entirely sure why you didn't walk away when you had the chance. I told you, she said, I can't leave a mess, Lydia. And she said quieter, I didn't want to. He looked at her. I didn't want to walk away, she said. I looked at you in that churchyard and I thought... She stopped herself because some things were easier to acknowledge at 4 a.m. than they were in the daylight with the other person 3 feet away. I thought that you looked like someone who needed someone to look at things clearly, and I'm good at that. So, the wind moved between them. The laundry shifted on the line. So, Ethan said, so I stayed. A long moment, the kind that means more than the words before it. Then Ethan said, come look at the South Ridge with me this afternoon. I've seen the South Ridge. Come look at it as ours, he said. She looked at him. He was looking back, and the expression on his face was the open one, the one she'd seen a handful of times, never when he expected it himself. All right, she said. What? They rode to the South Ridge in the early afternoon, when the light was going flat and silver the way it did in Montana winter, and they stood at the edge of the land that had been invisible in the records for years and looked at it, and it was not remarkable to look at. Scrub grass, frozen creek edge, the ridge rising bare and cold against the sky. But it was theirs, verifiably and legally theirs, and that made it the most interesting piece of land she'd ever stood on. Ethan said, in spring, we can run fence on the east edge and extend the grazing rotation. The creek comes closer to the surface on the north side, she said. Percy mentioned it. Better water access than the current rotation. You and Percy talk a lot. Percy is easier to talk to than you were in October, she said. He laughed. Actually laughed, which she'd heard twice before, both times briefly, like a man who was surprised by his own willingness to do it. And the sound of it went out into the cold air and disappeared into the silver sky. She looked at the ridge. She thought, this is what belonging feels like. Not the big declarations. This. She did not say it, because she was still being careful with hope. But she let herself feel it fully, standing on the South Ridge on a frozen January afternoon, for exactly as long as it took the wind to shift. Vivian arrived on a Wednesday in February, and she did not ride ahead. Lydia was in the kitchen when the wagon came up the yard. She heard it before she saw it, The particular sound of a good rig, well-kept horses, not the battered farm wagons that usually came to the ranch. She went to the window and looked out. The woman stepping down from the wagon was wearing a coat that had not been bought in Montana. She moved with the particular ease of someone who had gotten what she wanted out of life recently and had not yet had time to stop being pleased about it. Her hair was the Hartwell brown but worn beautifully. Her face was the face that had made rooms rearrange themselves, and she looked at the Wilder ranch yard with the calm, assessing gaze of someone taking inventory of a choice they hadn't made. Lydia stood at the kitchen window for one full breath. Then she dried her hands on her apron and went to the door. Vivian saw her at the same moment she opened it, and something moved across Vivian's face. Not guilt, exactly, though there was some of that. More the expression of a woman who had prepared several things to say and now wasn't sure which one fit. "Lydia," she said. "Vivian," Lydia said. There was a man in the wagon, young, well-dressed, watching the exchange with the uncomfortable patience of someone who has been told the short version of a complicated story and is now witnessing the longer one. "This is my husband," Vivian said. "Thomas Crane. We were married in September in Denver." "Hello," Lydia said to Thomas Crane. He said hello back. He had a decent face, honest, a little uncertain, the face of a man trying to understand what he'd married into. "Come inside," Lydia said. "What?" They sat in the parlor. Lydia had lit the fire that morning, for no reason she'd been able to name at the time, which she now thought might have been some animal awareness that the day was going to be the kind that needed a warm room. Vivian looked around the space with the slow, careful look of someone recognizing a place they'd imagined differently. "It's nicer than I expected," Vivian said. "What did you expect?" Lydia said. Vivian had the grace to look briefly caught. "I don't know. I suppose I thought—" She stopped. "You've done things to it." "I've cleaned it and organized it and mended the curtains," Lydia said. "It's not complicated." "Where's Ethan?" "In the south field. He'll be back by late afternoon." A pause. Thomas Crane was looking at the framed survey map Lydia had hung on the wall. She'd hung it there 2 weeks ago because she liked to look at it, liked to see the shape of the property made visible, and he seemed to find it interesting in a way that suggested he knew something about land, which was worth noting. Vivian set down her teacup. "I should apologize," she said. "Yes," Lydia agreed. Vivian blinked. She'd clearly expected more resistance to get through before she got to say the actual thing. What I did was, you left a man you didn't want to marry and went to find your own life," Lydia said. "I'm not angry about that, Vivian. I never was." "I left you to—" "You left before you knew what would happen," Lydia said. "You didn't plan for me to end up here. That's not the same as doing it deliberately." Vivian was quiet for a moment. "You sound like you've thought about this." "I had time." "Are you—" Vivian looked at her, and underneath the composure there was the actual question, the one that mattered. "Are you all right? Are you happy here?" Lydia looked at her sister, the beautiful face, the anxious eyes that Vivian had never let most people see. And she thought about the South Ridge and the 40 acres and Percy's hands in the evenings, and the letter from the Helena Bank, and Ethan's laugh going out into the cold air. "I'm getting there," she said. Vivian's face did something complicated that was probably the closest she got to crying in company. "Good," Vivian said. "I'm glad." The problem started the next morning. Vivian and Thomas stayed the night. It would have been poor form to turn them away in the dark. And Ethan had received Vivian's arrival with a control so complete that Lydia had thought, watching him shake Thomas Crane's hand and say the correct things, that he'd either processed it entirely in advance or he was holding something back for later. She suspected the latter. In the morning, over breakfast, Vivian walked through the house. She did it the way she did everything, naturally, as if the space belonged to her as much as anyone. And she made comments as she went. Not cruel ones, initially, just observations. The kitchen was well organized, the study was tidy, the parlor was, and here she paused, head tilted, cozy, in a practical sort of way. And then she walked into the main room and saw the account ledgers on the side table, open to the current month, and she picked one up and looked at it. "Is this what you do all day?" she asked. "Accounts?" "Among other things," Lydia said. Vivian put the ledger down with the careful placement of someone handling something they find slightly baffling. You were always like that, she said. Even at home. Always with the numbers. Someone had to be. Father managed the accounts. Lydia didn't say anything to that. Vivian turned and looked at the room again. The map on the wall, the stacked correspondence, the organized shelves, and her expression shifted into something that was trying to be neutral, but wasn't, quite. It looks like an office, Vivian said. It is an office, Lydia said. Also a home. Don't you want it to feel more? Vivian made a gesture that encompassed softness, decoration, femininity, all the things Lydia had never been any good at. More like somewhere you actually live? I actually live here, Lydia said. This is what it looks like when I live somewhere. Vivian looked at her. Then she said with a smile that was real but had something else behind it. You only have this life because I walked away. You know that. The room went very quiet. Vivian seemed to hear what she'd said a half second after she'd said it, and the smile flickered. I didn't mean, I know what you meant, Lydia said. I just meant that if things hadn't... I know, Lydia said. Her voice was steady. Her hands were still. Inside, in the chest, something was doing the thing it did when an old wound gets pressed. Not breaking open exactly, more like acknowledging it had always been there. You only have this life because I walked away. She'd known it, in some part of herself, since the beginning. She wasn't a fool. She knew how she'd come to be here, and she'd never pretended otherwise. But hearing it said out loud, in Vivian's voice, in the house that had been prepared for Vivian, in the room where Vivian's ghost had been a silent presence since the first day, it settled into her differently than she'd expected. She excused herself and went to the kitchen. She stood at the window for a while. The yard was quiet. Percy was somewhere on the property. Ethan was still in the south field. She thought about packing. It was not the first time she'd thought about it. She was an honest person, and honesty required acknowledging the thoughts that came, not just the ones you wanted. She thought about what it would mean to leave, to tell Ethan it wasn't working, that she'd made an effort and it hadn't been enough, and go back to the Hartwell house and the narrow bed and the accounts her father took credit for. She stood there long enough that the coffee on the stove started to burn. She took it off the heat. She did not pack. But something had shifted. Vivian's words had done what words do when they find the exact shape of a fear you've been carrying. They make it real in a new way, give it weight and edges it didn't have before. And the weight of it sat on her for the rest of the day, through lunch, through the afternoon, through the moment when she heard Ethan come in from the field and stamp the mud off his boots at the door. She was in the study when he found her. He looked at her face once and said, "What happened?" Vivian said something this morning, she said. It's not worth repeating. Then why does your face look like that? She looked up. Like what? Like you're somewhere else, he said. Like you're working something out that you don't want to work out. She looked at him for a moment, this man she'd married without being asked, who had turned out to be harder to dismiss than she'd expected, who had looked at her on the South Ridge and said, as ours like, he meant both parts of the word. She reminded me that I'm here because she left, Lydia said, and she's not wrong. She is wrong, Ethan said immediately. Ethan, she's wrong, he said again. He crossed the room and sat down across from her, not the careful distance he'd kept for months, but close, at the same table, with the same lamp between them that had been there on all the late nights and early mornings. You were the first person who ever talked to me like I was a person instead of a transaction. You know that? At the church. You said you don't have to. Nobody had ever said that to me. He stopped. His voice had gone rougher. Do you know what my father said to me the night before the wedding? He said, this is what the family needs. And Ethan, you do what the family needs. That's what I was. What the family needs. He looked at her steadily. And then you stood in that churchyard and you said something honest, which was the first honest thing anyone had said to me in years. And I thought, he stopped again. What? She said quietly. I thought, whoever she is, she sees things clearly, he said. And I was so tired of people who couldn't see clearly. The lamp between them burned steady. You weren't my second choice, he said. You were the first person who ever truly saw me. She held that. She turned it over carefully, the way she turned over everything, looking for the places where it didn't hold, where the math was wrong, where the feeling was real but the foundation was shaky. She couldn't find them. What she found instead was that she believed him. Not because she was desperate to, not because she needed it to be true, but because it matched what she'd seen, and she trusted what she saw more than most things. "She's leaving tomorrow," Lydia said. "Good," Ethan said. Then, more carefully, "Not because of her, just because I think it'll be easier for you." "I know," she said. "I think so too." He looked at her for another moment, and she looked back, and between them the space was smaller than it had ever been. Not nothing, not yet, but something neither of them was pretending wasn't there anymore. "Get some sleep," he said softly. "You first," she said. He almost smiled. He got up and went to the door and stopped there with his hand on the frame. "Lydia," he said. "What?" "You built this place," he said. "Not me. Not my father. You. That's not something Vivian gave you." He went upstairs. She sat in the study with the lamp burning and the account books open in front of her and the South Ridge in her mind, solid and real and legally, provably, indelibly theirs. She did not pack. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Vivian left on a Thursday morning with Thomas Crane and the good rig and the coat that hadn't been bought in Montana, and the yard felt different after the wagon disappeared down the road. Not emptier exactly, but cleaner, like a window that had been smudged and was now clear again. Lydia watched from the porch until the wagon was gone, then went back inside and opened the account books. She did not think about what Vivian had said, or she tried not to. The truth was that Vivian's words had lodged somewhere they couldn't be easily dislodged, and they came back at odd moments. When she was at the kitchen window in the early morning, or lying awake at 4, or walking the fence line with Percy, and finding herself suddenly aware that everything she was doing, everything she'd built in this place, rested on a foundation she hadn't chosen. She was here because Vivian had left. The ranch was improving because Ethan had needed someone, and she had been available. The South Ridge was theirs because she happened to read every page of every document in an old filing cabinet. Circumstance. All of it. Not destiny, not design. Just the accumulation of accidents that had somehow arranged themselves into something that felt, most days, like a life. She was aware that this was a dark way to think about it. She was also aware that she couldn't talk herself out of it simply by deciding it was unproductive, because that was not how her mind worked. Her mind worked by examining things thoroughly until they either held up or they didn't, and she hadn't finished examining this one yet. Ethan noticed. He noticed the way he'd started noticing things, quietly, without making a performance of it, just adjusting to the information and responding to it in small, practical ways. He brought her coffee one morning without being asked, setting it on the desk beside her without a word, and going back out to the yard. He told Percy to take on the south fence inspection so she could spend the full day on the Helena Bank correspondence, which had gotten complex in ways that required concentration. He did not ask her what was wrong because he'd learned that she didn't respond well to being asked what was wrong. She responded to being given the conditions to work it out, which was, she thought, a more accurate form of attention than most people managed. She was working it out. It just took time. The letter from Harlan Wilder came on a Friday, 3 weeks after Vivian left. It was addressed to Ethan, but Lydia was the one who retrieved the post from town that day, and she saw the return address and felt the particular alertness she'd learned to feel around anything connected to Harlan. Not fear, exactly, but the readiness of someone who has learned that a certain kind of quiet is often followed by something loud. She put the letter on Ethan's desk, unopened, and went back to the kitchen. He read it that evening. She was in the study going over the spring cattle projections when he came in and set the letter on the table in front of her without speaking. She picked it up and read it. It took her less than a minute. The language was formal, the sentences short, the intent so clear it barely needed interpreting. Harlan Wilder was requesting, the word requesting was doing considerable work in that sentence, given that the rest of the letter made plain it was not a request. That Ethan meet with him and the family's legal representative at the Wilder main house within the fortnight to discuss the matter of the marriage and the management of the Wilder ranch property. She read it again. The phrase "the matter of the marriage" was the one she kept coming back to. "He wants to discuss dissolving it," she said. Ethan was leaning against the doorframe. That's how I read it. "He's brought a lawyer in." "He has a lawyer in Helena he's used for years. Man named Greer." Lydia set the letter down. She looked at it on the table the way she looked at documents that were trying to do something to her. Directly, without flinching, trying to see the full shape of what she was dealing with. What does he want? She said. It wasn't really a question. He wants me to end the marriage and find what he'd call a more appropriate arrangement, Ethan said. He's been wanting that since the wedding. He didn't say it directly before because he was watching to see if the ranch improved. Now that it has, he sees value in the operation and he wants to control who's running it, Lydia said. Yes. She understood it completely, which didn't make it easier. Harlan Wilder was not a complicated man. He was a man who understood power and property and the connections between them, and who had watched his daughter-in-law, the plain, unwanted one, the backup, turn his son's failing ranch into something worth fighting over, and who had concluded that the situation needed to be corrected before it became permanent. What do you want to do? She said. Ethan looked at her steadily. I want to know what you want to do. That's not Lydia. He came away from the door frame and sat down across from her. That letter is about you. I'm not going to decide how to respond to it without asking you first. She looked at him. He was serious. Not performing seriousness, actually serious, the way he was about things that mattered to him. I want to go to the meeting, she said. You want to go? Yes, I want to sit in the room and hear what he says and understand exactly what we're dealing with. She paused. And I want to bring our documentation. Ethan was quiet for a moment. What documentation? Everything, she said. Every contract renegotiation, the water rights decision, the South Ridge filing, the Helena Bank refinancing. That finalized last week. We have the executed documents. The cattle sale figures from November. Every transaction I've managed and every record I've produced since I arrived. She looked at him. If he wants to argue that this marriage is an inconvenience to the Wilder family, I want him to argue it in front of a full accounting of what this marriage has done for the Wilder ranch. Ethan sat with that for a long moment. My father is going to say that none of that entitles you to anything legally, he said. He's going to say the ranch is his, and the marriage was entered under false pretenses, and his lawyer is going to have language for all of it. I know, Lydia said. I'm not bringing the documentation as a legal argument. I'm bringing it because I want him to have to look at it. I want him to have to sit in a room and look at the actual numbers and know that he knows what he knows. Ethan understood what she meant. Not a legal strategy, and a moral one, making Harlan sit with the truth of what his objection actually cost. All right, Ethan said. And Ethan, she said. Yes. She held his gaze. If you decide, when we're in that room or after, or whenever, that it's not worth it, that what he's threatening is too much to lose, I want you to tell me plainly. His expression changed. I'm not saying you will, she said. I'm saying that if you do, I'd rather hear it plainly than have it arranged around me. He looked at her for a long time. Then he said, I'm not going to tell you that. I'm telling you now so you don't have to wait to find out. She held that. Okay, she said. Okay, he said. They sat at the table for another hour, going through what they'd bring and how they'd organize it. And when they finally went to their separate rooms, the lamp in the study burned for a while longer than usual, because Lydia went back down after she heard Ethan go to bed and sat in the quiet with the documentation spread around her, checking it over one more time. She was not afraid, but she was honest enough to acknowledge that the floor could drop again, even now. She'd known it could drop. She'd known it all along. She checked the numbers until they were right, and then she put them away and went to bed. Percy found out about the meeting the next morning because Ethan told him, and Percy's response was characteristic. What do you need me to do? He said. Nothing, Ethan said. This is family business. Percy looked at Lydia. What do you need me to do? He said again, to her specifically. She thought about it. Come with us, she said. You've been on this ranch for 6 years. You know what it looked like before and what it looks like now. If Harlan tries to claim the improvements are incidental or unclear, you're a witness. Percy nodded. He looked at Ethan. All right? Ethan nodded. That was that. They rode to the Wilder main house on a Tuesday. It was a longer ride than Lydia had expected. The main house was on the far northwestern edge of the Wilder holdings, a part of the property she hadn't seen before. And the house itself, when they came over the rise and it appeared below them, was larger than she'd anticipated. Harlan Wilder's success, before it had started fraying, had been real, and the house showed it. 3 stories, real glass in every window, a covered porch that ran the full length of the front. She absorbed the size of it without comment and followed Ethan down the path to the front door. Harlan met them in the front hall. He was dressed formally, which told her the lawyer was already inside. He looked at Lydia and then at Percy and then back at Ethan. "This is a family matter," he said. "Lydia is my family," Ethan said. "Percy's been with the operation longer than I have. They're both here." A pause. Harlan's jaw moved once. "Come in," he said. The lawyer's name was Greer, and he was exactly what Lydia had expected. Competent, precise, the kind of man who treated language the way she treated numbers, finding the exact configuration that produced the result he needed. He was sitting at the dining room table when they came in, with papers organized in front of him, and he rose and shook hands all around with the professional warmth of someone who understood that procedure was more useful than hostility. Harlan sat at the head of the table. Lydia set her documentation on the table in front of her and folded her hands on top of it. Greer began. He was smooth about it, careful language, nothing inflammatory, framing everything as a practical question of ensuring the long-term stability of the Wilder family assets, concern for Ethan's well-being, the suggestion that the circumstances of the marriage had been unusual and that unusual circumstances sometimes benefited from review. He used the phrase review 4 times in the first 10 minutes. It was doing considerable work. He worked toward the argument gradually, and the argument, when it arrived, was this. The marriage had been entered into hastily, under duress created by a family crisis, without Ethan's full and considered consent. There were grounds, Greer suggested carefully, to seek an annulment. Not because anyone wished Lydia ill, not because of any personal objection, simply because the foundation of the arrangement had been constructed under conditions that a court might find, and here he paused, choosing his word, impulsive. Harlan was watching Ethan when Greer said this. Ethan was watching his father back. Lydia waited. The ranch, Greer continued, would naturally revert to the family trust during any transition period. Harlan, as the trust administrator, would— Wait, Ethan said. Greer stopped. The family trust, Ethan said. Say that again. Greer glanced at Harlan. The Wilder family trust, which holds the property in the trust my father administers. Yes. Since when? Ethan said. A pause that was slightly too long. The trust has been in place since— Greer looked at his papers. Since 1875. That's not right, Lydia said. Everyone looked at her. She had not spoken since they'd sat down, and the quality of the silence around her first words was the kind that happens when a room realizes it has underestimated someone. She opened her documentation. The original property deed filed with the Territorial Land Office in 1871 lists Ethan James Wilder as the primary property holder in remainder, with his father Harlan Wilder listed as administrator during Ethan's minority. She found the page and slid it across the table toward Greer. Ethan turned 21 in 1875, which means the remainder interest converted to full ownership in 1875, the same year your trust was established. She paused. I'd be interested to see the trust document. Greer looked at this page she'd given him. Harlan looked at Lydia for the first time in the meeting with something other than dismissal. The trust document, Ethan said, very quietly. That's a separate matter, Greer said. The trust was established to— The trust document, Ethan said again. Greer reached into his papers with the careful movements of someone who has found himself in a conversation he didn't expect to be in. He produced a document and slid it across the table. Lydia read it faster than seemed possible to the other people in the room. She turned pages. She went back to the second page. She read a particular section twice. Then she looked up at Harlan Wilder and said, "This trust document doesn't include the ranch." Silence. The assets listed here are the accounts receivable from the 1873 cattle season, the Helena property, and the equipment inventory, she said. The land, the actual ranch land, is not listed in this trust. It's not a trust asset. She looked at Greer. The deed I showed you stands. Ethan has owned this land outright since 1875. Greer was very still. Harlan was looking at his lawyer. Ethan was looking at his father. Pa, Ethan said. His voice had gone very quiet, the way it went when he was working something out that he didn't want to be working out. Tell me you didn't know. Harlan said nothing. Tell me, Ethan said, That you didn't know for the last 8 years that the ranch was mine, and you let me run it like I was managing your property, and you let me believe I could lose it if I disappointed you. The room was very still. Harlan Wilder looked at his son, and what moved across his face was complicated. Not guilt, exactly, because Lydia didn't think Harlan was capable of clean guilt, but something related to it, something that acknowledged, without quite admitting, that a calculation had been made and maintained for a long time and was now exposed. The arrangement was practical, Harlan said. The arrangement was a lie, Ethan said. Ethan, you told me you could take the ranch if I didn't run it to your satisfaction. Ethan's voice was still quiet. It was the worst kind. The kind that was quiet because it had gone past the stage where raising your voice would help. You said that when I was 23. You said it when I took over the operation. You've said it every time I've made a decision you didn't approve of. And the whole time, he stopped. Was it ever true, any of it? Harlan's jaw set. The trust was meant to answer the question. A long silence. You were young, Harlan said finally. You made bad decisions. Someone had to answer the question, Ethan said. Harlan looked at the table. It was the most complete answer he was going to give. Greer gathered his papers with the professional efficiency of a man removing himself from a situation that had departed from his original brief. I was not unkind about it. He said something measured about reviewing the relevant documents further and that they should consider the matter ongoing, which was lawyer language for I need to talk to my client privately before anyone says anything that can't be unsaid. He shook hands. He left. Harlan remained at the table. The four of them, Harlan, Ethan, Lydia, Percy, who had said nothing in the meeting and whose presence had nonetheless been substantial, the way a large and steady thing is substantial, sat in the dining room of the house that Harlan had built when he thought he was building an empire, and the afternoon light came in through the good glass windows, and nobody spoke for a while. Percy was looking at the wall. He had the face he got when he was waiting for something to finish. Harlan was the one who broke the silence. The woman, he said, meaning Lydia, but not looking at her, talking to Ethan. She found all of that. Yes, Ethan said, from my files. From our files, Ethan said, on our ranch. Another pause. She's managed the accounts, Harlan said. It wasn't a question. He'd seen the documentation she'd laid out. He'd watched her organize and present it with the efficiency of someone who had been doing this for years. Since October. Since the second week, Ethan said. She found the feed contract issue in the first night, the water rights document in the first month, the South Ridge in December. Harlan was quiet for a moment. The South Ridge. He said it slowly. I knew about the survey discrepancy. Lydia looked at him. I intended to address it, Harlan said, when the time was right. She didn't ask when he'd thought the time would be right. The answer was when it suited him, when it could be leveraged into something, when it could be used rather than simply corrected. She understood Harlan Wilder well enough now to know that his way of holding things was always instrumental. Everything was a tool until it wasn't useful anymore. She addressed it, Ethan said. Harlan looked at Lydia for a long moment. She held it. You're not what I expected, he said. I know, she said. No one ever does. He looked at her with something that was not quite respect. She didn't think Harlan was capable of giving her that. Not easily, not yet, maybe not ever, but was at least the acknowledgement that she was a different category of thing than he'd assumed. That the calculation he'd made about her when he looked at her in that churchyard and said that one had been wrong in ways that had material consequences. The annulment, he said. I withdraw the request. There was no formal request yet, Lydia said. Your lawyer hadn't filed anything. Then I withdraw the intent, Harlan said, with some of his old dryness returning. A pause. And the rest of it, Ethan said. Harlan looked at his son. What rest? The other things you've held over my head for 8 years, Ethan said. The implied threats. The visits where you remind me how much I owe to the family name. The comments about my decisions and my management and who I am and who I should have married. He said this without heat, which was more effective than heat would have been. I'm done with that arrangement, Pa. It was built on something that wasn't true, and now we all know it, and I'm done. Harlan was still for a long time. You're angry, he said. I'm clear, Ethan said. There's a difference. Something moved across Harlan's face, something old and complicated that Lydia thought might be the closest Harlan Wilder came to grief. Not for the confrontation, for something further back, something about the shape of the relationship he'd built with his son, which he'd built the only way he knew how, and which had apparently been load-bearing in his understanding of himself for a very long time. She felt, against her better judgment, a small and careful sympathy for him. Not enough to shift anything, just enough to remind her that even people who did damage were usually more than the damage they did. "All right," Harlan said. It was not an apology, but it was a ceding. The difference between the two was significant, and she took note of it without comment. "What?" They rode home in the late afternoon, the three of them, with the light going long and gold behind them. Percy rode slightly ahead, which was his way of giving people space while remaining present, which Lydia had come to appreciate about him. She and Ethan rode side by side. For the first mile or so, they didn't talk. She thought about the dining room table and the trust document and the deed, and the way Ethan's face had gone through several things when he'd understood what his father had built around him. She thought about 8 years of a man believing he could lose something that had always been his. She thought about the particular cruelty of that, not dramatic cruelty, not the cruelty that announces itself, but the slow, quiet kind that just arranges the truth slightly out of reach. "You didn't know," she said finally. "No," Ethan said. "About the deed." "I signed so many documents when I took over from him," Ethan said. "He walked me through everything and I signed what he put in front of me. I was 23. He was my father. It didn't occur to me to—" He stopped. "I trusted him." She nodded. She didn't say anything about trust or about fathers or about the difference between what people show you and what is actually true, because he knew all of that already, and it didn't need saying. "You own it," she said instead. "You own it clean. The house, the land, the South Ridge, all of it. That's what's true now." He was quiet for a moment. "We own it," he said. She looked at him. "It's not just mine," he said. "It hasn't been just mine since October." She held that. "Legally it is," she said. "Not the way I mean," he said. The horses moved, the land moved past. Above them the sky was going from gold to the pale blue that came before dark, and the mountains were holding their shapes against it the way they always did. She didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything to say that would be better than the silence. But she let herself feel it, the thing she'd been being careful with since the South Ridge, since the lamp burning late, since the two of them at the kitchen table finding things in old documents that changed the shape of what they had. She let herself feel it without immediately looking for the places where it might not hold. It held. Percy came to find her the next morning early, before Ethan was up. He knocked on the kitchen door, and she let him in, and he stood at the table with his hat in his hands, which meant he had something to say that he'd been working up to. "I want you to know," he said, "what you did yesterday, coming prepared like that. Nobody's ever—" He stopped. He was not a man who spoke fluently about things that moved him, and she respected that he was trying. Harlan Wilder has been a weight on this place for a long time. On Ethan. For a long time. And you walked in there, and you put the right papers on the table, and you just— He made a gesture that was the whole of it. "I read everything," she said. "That's just what I do." "I know," Percy said. "That's what I'm saying." He put his hat back on and went back out to the yard. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Then she made coffee and sat down with the spring projections, because the ranch didn't stop needing attention just because yesterday had been significant, and there was still a fence to extend on the South Ridge, and a second round of contract negotiations to think about, and a letter from a cattle buyer in Miles City that she hadn't finished responding to. The work was there and she was good at it, and that had always been enough. She was still sitting there when Ethan came downstairs. He stopped in the doorway and looked at her at the table with the papers spread around her and the coffee going and the early light coming through the window. And something in his face was the quiet kind of full that people don't have words for because the words always seem like too much or not enough. "Come look at something," he said. She looked up. "What?" "Just come." She followed him out through the back of the house and around the side to the section of the yard that faced southeast, where you could see the far edge of the property in the morning light. The South Ridge was just visible from here on clear days, and today was clear, cold and sharp and completely clear, The sky, the particular hard blue that Montana did in late winter like it was making a point. He stood beside her and looked at it. She stood beside him and looked at it too. My father built that house with money he made before I was born, Ethan said. He told me my whole life that the ranch was built on his decisions and his sacrifice, and that I was the inheritor of something I hadn't earned. He was quiet for a moment. Yesterday you showed me a deed that says I've owned this land since I was 21. But more than that, he turned to look at her. You showed me what it actually looks like when someone earns something, what that costs, what that takes. She looked at him. I watched you, he said, every day since October. I watched you ride 3 hours alone to look at a creek. I watched you sit up until midnight with documents nobody else wanted to touch. I watched you walk into my father's house yesterday with a stack of paper that you'd built from scratch and put it on his table like it was the most natural thing in the world. He stopped. That's not circumstance. That's not being in the right place at the right time. That's who you are. The cold was sharp around them. Vivian said what she said, Ethan continued, and it's been sitting on you since she left. I know it has. I've seen it. She didn't deny it. You're here because you stayed, he said. That's the only reason that matters. Not because she left. Not because your father offered you. Because when you had the chance to walk away, you didn't. And every single day since then, you've made a choice to stay. That's not an accident. That's a decision. That's yours. She looked at him for a long time. She thought about the churchyard and the ledgers and the creek and the south ridge and the dining room table. She thought about 4 a.m. and cold coffee and documents that turned out to say something different than everyone assumed. She thought about the small things, Percy's hands, the coffee she'd made for a man who hadn't thanked her for weeks, the laundry on the line in the freeze. She had built this. She knew that. She'd known it for a while, in the part of her that tracked things honestly. But knowing something and believing it were different, and she'd been working toward the believing part, and Ethan standing here in the cold telling her what he'd seen, not performing it, not saying it to make her feel better, just telling her what was true from where he stood, was the thing that closed the distance. I know, she said. Do you? He said. I'm getting there, she said. I'm closer than I was yesterday. He looked at her, and what was in his face was the open version, the one she'd come to know as his truest expression, the one that cost him something to show. He reached out and took her hand. Not a gesture, not a courtesy. Just his hand around hers, in the cold, in the morning, on the land that was theirs. She looked down at it. Then she looked back at the south ridge, the hard blue sky, the shape of everything they'd made from the broken thing they'd started with. She didn't let go. She didn't let go of his hand for a long time. That was how it started. Not with declarations, not with anything that could be called a turning point in the way stories usually manufacture them, but with two people standing in the cold holding on, and the land around them going on being land, indifferent and patient and entirely real. When she finally let go, it was because her fingers had gone numb, and because there was work to do, which was always true, and because she'd learned by now that the moments that matter don't need to be extended past their natural end. You let them be what they are, and then you go back inside and make coffee and get on with things, and they stay in you anyway. They don't need protecting. Spring came the way. Montana. Spring always came, arguing with winter for weeks before winter finally backed down, grudgingly, leaving mud and cold mornings and the particular relief of seeing the grass begin to return to the south ridge. Lydia walked the fence line they'd extended in March, and looked at the new posts and thought about the 40 acres that had been invisible for 7 years, now properly fenced, now running cattle, now producing something measurable. She thought a lot about invisible things that spring. The Miles City buyer's name was Roland Fitch, and he arrived in April with 2 associates and a very specific idea of what the Wilder Ranch could offer his operation. He was a large-scale distributor, the kind of buyer who didn't come to individual ranches unless the individual ranch had something worth coming for. And he'd written back to Lydia's letter with the careful enthusiasm of a man who hadn't expected to find what he was looking at, but was willing to be convinced. Ethan had been skeptical. He's too big, Ethan said, the evening before Fitch was due. Operations his size don't deal with ranches our size. There's something he wants that he's not saying. There's always something people want that they're not saying, Lydia said. That's not the same as a problem. The question is whether what he wants and what we have are compatible. And if they're not, then he rides back to Miles City and we've lost an afternoon. She was reviewing the cattle count projections she'd prepared for the meeting. We're not obligated to make a deal just because he came. Ethan leaned back in his chair and looked at her. She'd noticed over the months that he did this. Looked at her when he was thinking, not because he was waiting for her to say something, but because she'd become, in some way she found both touching and slightly inconvenient, a reference point for him. A way of checking his own thinking against something he trusted. "What do you think he wants?" Ethan said. "I think he's looking for a reliable supplier at volume," she said. "He's been working with an operation outside Great Falls that's been inconsistent. I've been following the market reports. There have been 2 delivery failures in the last year from that region. A buyer his size can't afford inconsistency. It cascades through his whole distribution chain." She looked up. "We've been consistent. Every delivery on time, every head counted correctly, documentation clear. That's what we're selling him, not just cattle." Ethan was quiet for a moment. "You figured all that out from market reports," he said. "And Percy," she said. "Percy knows more about what's happening in the territory than anyone I've ever met. He just doesn't volunteer it." "Percy doesn't volunteer anything." "He does if you ask the right questions," she said. "You just have to find the right questions." Fitch arrived with less ceremony than Lydia had expected from a man of his size. He was somewhere in his 50s, thick through the shoulders, with a handshake that meant something, and eyes that did the same kind of quick assessment she'd been subjected to her whole life, except that his assessment was of the property and the operation rather than her person, which she found comparatively easy to tolerate. He toured the ranch with Ethan in the morning. Lydia did not go on the tour. She had found, over time, that men like Fitch responded better to Ethan when she wasn't walking beside him. Not because she was wrong about things, but because there was a version of the conversation that was easier for Ethan to have without her present. A version where 2 men could talk about cattle and land in the shorthand they shared. And she didn't need to be in every room for the operation to succeed. She'd learned that this wasn't diminishment, it was efficiency. She had opinions about many things, but one of her stronger ones was that needing to be present for every transaction was a form of insecurity she didn't have time for. She was in the study reviewing the supply chain documentation when they came back. Fitch sat down across from her and looked at the papers she laid out for him. The delivery records, the cattle condition assessments, the seasonal projections for the next 2 years. And he did not look at them the way most people looked at her paperwork, which was with a slight surprise that it was as thorough as it was. He looked at it like a man who recognized what he was seeing. "You put these together," he said. "Yes." "All of them?" "Yes." He nodded. He turned a page. He was quiet for a while. "The Great Falls supplier," he said eventually. "I don't know their operation," she said. "I wouldn't comment on it." "I'm not asking you to." He looked up. "I'm saying that the thing I'm missing from them is this." He gestured at the documentation. "Somebody who thinks ahead, who knows what I need before I ask." She held his gaze. "What do you need?" He told her. It was a longer list than she'd expected and more specific. Delivery windows that aligned with his distribution schedule, particular weight classes, certification documentation that he'd been trying to standardize across his suppliers for 2 years without success, a communication protocol for variations in the delivery count. She listened without writing anything down, which she could see surprised him, and when he finished, she went through his list point by point and told him which parts she could commit to, which parts needed discussion with Ethan, and which parts she thought he'd be better served adjusting his expectations on, with specific reasons for each. Fitch looked at her for a long moment when she finished. "You're not going to tell me you can do everything," he said. "No, that would be lying to you, and lying to you now would cost more later than it would save." He nodded slowly. "Most people tell me what I want to hear." "Most people are afraid of you," she said. "I'm not afraid of you. You came here because you need something we have. I'd like to find out if we can work together. That's a conversation between equals, or it's not worth having." Percy, who had been standing near the doorway in his characteristic way of being present without imposing, made a very small sound that was probably a laugh suppressed in time. Fitch looked at her for another moment. Then he said, "What's your counter on the per-head rate?" They reached an agreement by late afternoon. It was not a perfect agreement. No agreement was, but it was a fair one, with terms that Lydia had documented before Fitch arrived, and which she went through line by line with both him and Ethan before anyone put their name on anything. The rate was better than any of their existing contracts. The delivery schedule was manageable. The certification documentation requirement was the part they'd pushed back on hardest, and the version they'd landed on was a reasonable compromise. Fitch shook Ethan's hand, then hers, which she noted because not all men of his type extended that courtesy, and she filed it under things that told her something useful about who he was. He rode out as the afternoon light was shifting. Ethan and Lydia stood in the yard. "You told him you weren't afraid of him," Ethan said. "I'm not." "I know." A pause. "He liked it." "He respected it," she said. "That's different. Liking is nice. Respect is useful." Ethan looked at the road where Fitch had gone, then back at her. "The certification documentation. I'll build the template this week," she said. "It's not complicated, just time." "You can hand part of it to me," he said. She looked at him. "Which part?" "The delivery confirmation records. I can maintain those." She considered. "You'd have to do them exactly right. Fitch's system doesn't have room for variations." "Then show me exactly how to do them," he said. "You don't have to carry everything yourself." She held that for a moment. It was not the first time he'd said something like it, but it landed differently each time, partly because she was still adjusting to it. The idea that the things she carried could be shared rather than simply set down. Setting them down felt like failure. Sharing them felt she was slowly learning, like something else. "All right," she said. Summer brought growth and the specific complications that came with it. The additional cattle on the South Ridge required an adjustment to the watering rotation, which Percy managed with his usual economy of comment and movement. 2 new ranch hands joined the operation in June, younger men, brothers from outside Billings, who came with references from an operation Lydia had written to specifically, because she had decided that growing the workforce without vetting it carefully would undo gains faster than almost anything else. She interviewed them herself, which they found unexpected, and which she declined to apologize for. The elder one, whose name was Davis, turned out to have a practical intelligence that reminded her of Percy. The younger one, Cal, same name as her brother, which she found privately amusing, was better with animals than with people, but made up for it in sheer reliable effort. They both stayed. They both worked out. The Fitch deliveries began in July. The first one went exactly as documented. The second had a variation of 4 head due to a fence break the week before, and Lydia sent the notification and revised count to Fitch's office 48 hours in advance of the delivery date, which Fitch later told Ethan was the first time any supplier had ever given him advance notice of a variation rather than an apology after the fact. Ethan told her this in the kitchen one evening, relaying it with the careful flatness of someone who was trying not to make too much of it, which meant he was making quite a lot of it internally. He said the 48 hours changes everything for his scheduling, Ethan said. "It costs us almost nothing to do it," she said. "It costs him enormously not to have it." "I know, that's what he said." She went back to the documentation she was working on. Ethan sat down across from her. She looked up. "What?" she said. "You built something real," he said. "I want you to know that I know that." "I know you know that," she said. "I say it anyway because—" He stopped, tried again. "My father said it to me once, that the measure of a thing was whether it lasted, that anything that didn't last wasn't worth building." He looked at the papers between them. "I used to think he was right about that, and wrong about everything else. Now I think he was right about that, and he just didn't understand what lasting actually required." She looked at him. "It requires someone who pays attention," he said. "Someone who sees the things that are about to go wrong before they go wrong, and fixes them, and doesn't need anyone to notice that they fixed them." "People notice," she said. "Most people don't." "The people who matter notice," she said. "That's enough." He was quiet for a moment, then quietly, "I notice." She looked at him across the table, the lamp between them the way it had been on the first night and every late night since. And she thought about all the things that had changed, and the fact that this, the table, the lamp, the 2 of them at the end of a long day, hadn't changed, and that there was something important in that consistency, something she'd been too careful about for too long. "I know you do," she said. In August, her father came to visit. Chester Hartwell had written ahead this time, which was more than Vivian had managed, and his letter had been formal in the way of a man who isn't sure how he'll be received and is using formality as protection. He came alone. Her mother wasn't well enough for the journey. And he arrived looking older than she remembered, which was always the shock of seeing a parent after a long time away. The gap between who they were in your memory and who they are in the present. He stood in the yard and looked at the operation, the extended fence line, the additional hands moving around the property, the barn that had been repaired in spring, the general quality of a working place that was working, and his face did something she recognized as the struggle between pride and the guilt that makes pride complicated. She brought him inside. They sat in the kitchen and she made coffee, and for the first few minutes they talked about her mother and the Southfield back home, and whether Cal was handling the accounts properly since she'd left. She'd written him detailed instructions and checked in twice by letter, and the answer seemed to be that he was managing, mostly, which was probably the best honest answer. Then her father said, "I should have asked you." She looked at him. "Before I offered you to the Wilders," he said, "I should have asked whether you were willing. I didn't ask because—" He stopped, picked up his coffee, set it down. "Because I assumed you'd say yes if I needed you to, and asking would have made it harder if you'd said no." She held this. "I would have said yes," she said. "I know. That's why I should have asked." He looked at her directly. "You've spent your life saying yes to things I didn't ask about, because you knew I needed you to, and you're not the kind of person who makes it harder on the people she loves." He shook his head slightly. "That's a generous thing to be, and I took advantage of it, for years, without thinking about what it cost you." She was quiet for a moment. "Pa," she said, "look around." He looked at the kitchen. Then she took him through the house, the study with its organized files, the parlor, out to the yard where Ethan was talking to Davis about the south pasture rotation, and looked up and nodded at Chester without ceremony, the way he nodded at someone who belonged in the same picture as everything else. She took her father to the edge of this property and showed him the south ridge. He stood at the fence and looked at the 40 acres that had been invisible for 7 years and now had 28 head on them, grazing in the summer heat. "You found this," he said. "In the filing cabinet," she said, reading everything. He looked at the ridge for a long time. "Your mother always said," he started and stopped. "What?" "She said you were the one who saw clearly." He was still looking at the ridge. "She said it from the time you were 8 years old. She said, that one sees things." A pause. "I heard her say it, and I thought it meant you'd be fine. That you didn't need the same looking after because you could see clearly yourself, and instead I just—" He exhaled. "I left you to see clearly without making sure anyone was seeing you." She stood beside her father at the fence and looked at the ridge and thought about being seen, what it meant, what it cost when you weren't, and what it turned out to feel like when you finally were. She thought about Ethan in the cold morning telling her that what she'd built wasn't accident or circumstance but decision, every day renewed. She thought about Percy's hands wrapped at the kitchen table, and Roland Fitch extending his handshake, and the lamp burning late over documents that had turned out to say something different than everyone had assumed. "I'm fine, Pa," she said. "I know," he said. "That's not the point." "I know it's not the point," she said. "I'm saying it anyway." He put his arm around her shoulders, briefly, the way he'd done when she was small, and she let him, and they stood there looking at the 40 acres that were theirs. And she thought that some things could be both true at once, that you'd been underestimated, and you'd still become what you were going to become, that people had failed you and you loved them anyway, that the life you hadn't chosen had turned out to be more fully yours than anything you might have designed. Ethan took her father to the South Ridge on horseback that afternoon, and she watched them go from the kitchen window, 2 men on horses, one older and slightly uncertain in the saddle, one at ease with the land the way a person gets when the land is genuinely theirs. And she thought that this too was part of it, the accommodating of each other's histories, the slow work of becoming family to the family your person already had. She went back to the Fitch documentation and finished it before supper. Her father left on Saturday morning. Before he went, he shook Ethan's hand for a long time, which Ethan accepted with the patience he'd developed for emotional moments that didn't have a clean resolution, and he hugged Lydia in the way of a man trying to put an apology into his arms because he hadn't found all the words for it yet. Write more often, she told him. I will, he said. He probably would now. People meant their intentions better after certain conversations. She watched the wagon down the road, the way she'd watched Vivian's wagon, the way she'd watched Fitch's horse, the way she'd watched Harlan Wilder's rig the morning after the dining room meeting when he'd ridden home without the power he'd thought he had. She'd watched a lot of things leave this yard. Each departure changed the yard a little, left a slightly different version of the space behind. She turned back to the house. Fall came back around the way it always did. The light going sideways in gold, the cold arriving in the mornings a little earlier each day. The particular Montana smell of autumn that she had come to recognize now as home smell, which was something she hadn't been sure would happen, and which had happened so gradually she'd only noticed it after the fact. The second cattle sale of Lydia's tenure at the Wilder Ranch was a different thing from the first. Not just in numbers, though the numbers were substantially better, with the Fitch contract supplementing the existing buyers and the South Ridge cattle adding to the volume in ways that showed up clearly in the final accounting. It was different in the way the county treated it. The people who came, the buyers, the neighboring ranchers, the men who'd been to the first sale and remembered what the Wilder operation had looked like then, moved through the event with a different quality of attention. Not toward Ethan, or not only, toward both of them. She heard it in the conversation she passed through, fragments, references, the particular way people talk about someone when they're trying to be fair to a story they hadn't expected to admire. The Wilder wife, the one who found the water rights, the one who found 40 acres that were missing from the records, the one who brought Roland Fitch out from Miles City. She heard her name said with the kind of weight that meant something, and she heard it without the qualifier she'd been attached to for the first months. The replacement, the other one, the second daughter, the one nobody wanted. She was Lydia Wilder now. That was enough. That was more than enough, Mrs. Aldrich from the post office found her between conversations and said, with the genuine warmth of someone who'd been watching from a distance and had a right to a feeling about it, "You know what people are saying." "I've heard some of it," Lydia said. "They're saying this is the best the Wilder Ranch has looked in 10 years. "The cattle are strong this season," Lydia said. "The South Ridge edition made the difference." "That's not what I mean, and you know it," Mrs. Aldrich said pleasantly, and moved on. The evening after the sale, when the buyers had gone and the final numbers were written down and Percy had taken the last of the cattle back to the ranch with Davis and young Cal, Ethan came to find her in the study. She was at the desk, which was where she usually was. The lamp was lit, which it usually was. He stood in the doorway. "Come see something," he said. She looked up. "The accounts aren't finished." "They'll keep an hour." She set down her pen. He led her upstairs past her door to the end of the hall, and then he stopped in front of the door at the very end, the one she'd walked past 1,000 times, the one that connected to a small room she'd been using for storage, linen, and out-of-season things. He opened the door. She stepped through. The room had been rearranged. The storage was gone. She didn't know when he'd moved it, when he'd done any of this. The window was clean. On the small table there were dried flowers, the kind that lasted, pale and honest, not the elaborate fresh arrangement that had been decaying in her room on the first day. A quilt was folded across the chair, not the one that had been there for Vivian, not the one that had carried the ghost of someone else's expectation. A new one, made from fabric she recognized, the brown wool from the curtain she'd replaced in the kitchen, the blue cotton from the shirt she'd mended and then retired, small scraps of things that were already part of the house she'd been living in. Someone had made it. Percy's wife, she realized later. Percy had a wife in town she'd met twice, a quiet woman who made things with her hands because she found it calming, and he'd clearly asked her without mentioning why. She stood in the room for a long moment. "I moved the linens to the storage room off the kitchen," Ethan said. "It made more sense there anyway." "It does," she said. "Percy's wife made the quilt. I told her the house was yours, that whatever she made should be for the person who lives here." She looked at the quilt. The scraps of her own life, sewn together by someone who'd been told she was the person who lived here. Not a replacement, not an afterthought. The person. "Ethan," she said. "I know it's a small room," he said. "It's not for sleeping. I thought—" He stopped. Tried again, which was always what he did, always the second attempt that got closer to the true thing. "I thought you needed a room that was just yours, Not the study, which is also the working room. Not the bedroom, which is the room that was prepared for someone else. He looked at her. A room that has nothing in it that wasn't chosen for you. Just you. Nobody else. She looked at the dried flowers and the made quilt and the clean window and the small room that was exactly the right size for sitting in and thinking, for reading, for being a person who needed space that was entirely her own rather than shared with an operation or a memory or a history she'd inherited without being asked. She sat down in the chair. The quilt was soft in the way of something made with attention. Ethan stood in the doorway and didn't say anything, which was the right thing to do, and she sat for a moment and let the room be what it was. Hers, specifically, made for the specific person she was, rather than the general idea of a wife, or a replacement, or a woman who'd ended up here by accident. This home was never meant for someone else, Ethan said quietly, from the doorway. I think it was waiting for you. I think a lot of things were. She looked at him. There were things she could have said, the kinds of things that get said at the end of stories, the large, true statements that sum things up. She had some of them available, but she thought about what she'd actually learned, about the difference between the right words and the true moment, about how the true moment usually didn't need the words you'd prepared for it, and she let the large statements stay where they were. Come sit, she said. He came in and sat on the edge of the low bench under the window, and the room was small enough that they were close, and the lamp made the space warm, and outside the Montana dark was doing what it did, which was being enormous and cold and full of stars that didn't care about any particular human life, but that looked from the right window at the right moment like they might. They sat for a while without talking. Then she said, "The South Ridge is going to need another 10 posts before winter." "Percy knows," Ethan said. He told Davis, but I'm not sure Davis understood the soil issue on the north side. "Lydia," Ethan said. "What?" "1 hour," he said. "Just 1 hour where we don't fix anything." She looked at him. He was half smiling, the real one, the one that took him by surprise. And she thought that a year ago she hadn't known that smile existed, hadn't known this man existed in the way that he actually was, rather than the way she'd imagined him from a distance. She thought about all the things you couldn't know until you stayed, all the things that only became visible after enough time in the same space. 1 hour, she said. There is a particular thing that happens to people who are consistently underestimated. They develop, over time, one of two responses. The first is that they begin to believe it. The second is that they do not believe it, but they learn to carry it quietly. The knowledge of their own capacity held close. Not hidden exactly, just not offered freely to people who haven't earned the right to see it. Lydia had been the second kind since she was 16 and balancing her father's accounts while her father explained to guests what a head for figures meant. She'd carried it quietly across a churchyard. She'd carried it into a marriage she hadn't chosen. She'd carried it through ledgers and contracts and a filing cabinet full of documents that turned out to say something different than everyone had assumed, and through a creek bed and a county recorder's office, and a lawyer's dining room table and a cattle sale where the numbers finally said what she'd known they could say. And she'd learned, slowly, imperfectly, with setbacks she'd had to sit with in the 4 a.m. dark, that carrying something quietly is not the same as carrying it alone. That there is a difference between not needing to be seen and choosing not to be seen. That the person who sits across from you at a kitchen table, night after night, learning to read the documents you've put in front of him and asking which parts he can carry, is offering something real. She had been a woman everyone ignored because she was easy to ignore. Plain, quiet, the one who did the work without making it into a story. And then she'd arrived somewhere that was broken and needed seeing, and she'd seen it. And the seeing had been its own answer to the question she'd been carrying since she was old enough to know that the world measured people and had already taken her measure and found it unremarkable. The measure was wrong. Not because she was special, she didn't think she was special, she thought she was competent and observant and willing to stay when staying was hard, which was not special so much as rare, and the distinction mattered. Special was something you were born. Rare was something you chose over and over in the small moments that nobody was watching. She'd chosen it in the kitchen the first night, starting dinner because nobody else had. She'd chosen it at the creek, and in the filing cabinet, and at the dining room table with her papers laid out in front of a man who had underestimated her since the day they met. She'd chosen it when Vivian's words landed and she didn't pack. She'd chosen it every 4 in the morning since October, sitting down to the work because the work was real and because she was good at it and because the ranch was worth something and so was she. There was no single moment it became hers. That was the thing about belonging. It wasn't a door you walked through. It was a room you built, over time, with available materials, and you didn't always know you were building it until you looked up one day and saw walls. A year after the wedding, the Wilder Ranch signed its third long-term supply contract, this one with a buyer in Billings who had heard about the Fitch arrangement and wanted something similar. Lydia negotiated it over 2 weeks of correspondence and 1 afternoon in person, and when it was done, the ranch's projected income for the coming year was the highest it had been in its entire history. She wrote this in the account book the way she wrote everything, clearly, without ceremony, the numbers saying what they said. Ethan looked over her shoulder at the number and didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "Is that right?" "I checked it 3 times, she said. He was quiet. "It's right," she said. He put his hand on her shoulder, briefly, warm, and then went back out to the yard because that was who he was. A man who took the significant things and held them quietly and let them settle into him while he did the next necessary thing. She understood that. She was the same way. Percy came to find her that afternoon, which was unusual. Percy came to find her for practical things, not for conversation. He stood in the kitchen doorway with his hat in his hands again. "There's something I want to say," he said. "Go ahead," she said. "I've been on this ranch for 7 years," he said. "I've seen it when it was in good shape and when it wasn't. I've seen Harlan run it and Ethan run it." He paused. "I've seen what you've done to it." She waited. "You never asked anyone to notice," he said. "I noticed." It was the longest personal statement Percy had made in her presence, and it cost him something to make it. She could see that in the set of his jaw and the way he was looking slightly to her left, which was where Percy looked when he was getting through something he'd decided to get through. "Thank you, Percy," she said. He nodded. He put his hat back on. "South fence is holding," he said, returning to his natural register. "Davis is learning the soil issue on the north side." "Good," she said. "Tell him about the drainage in the spring, too. He'll need to know it by March." Percy nodded again and went back to his work. She stood in the kitchen for a moment. Outside, she could hear Ethan and Davis talking somewhere near the barn. She could hear young Cal whistling off-key, the way he did when he was working with the horses. She could hear Percy's footsteps going back to whatever fence he was checking, steady and reliable as everything Percy did. She could hear the ranch being a working ranch. It was not a sound she'd expected to love. She'd expected to tolerate it, the noise and the cold and the smell and the pace of it, the way the work never actually finished, the way every solved problem revealed 2 more waiting behind it. She'd expected to manage it the way she managed everything, practically, effectively, without sentiment. But she loved it. The specific, inconvenient, unpoetic truth was that she loved the sound of the Wilder Ranch working, loved it in the way you love something that is genuinely yours, that you have earned through attention and stubbornness and the willingness to read every page of every document in a filing cabinet that nobody had touched for 7 years. She went back to the account books. There was a feed order to confirm and a letter to write to the county recorder about the spring property review and a question from Davis about the North Pasture schedule that she'd promised to look into. The work was there. She was good at it. She sat down and got on with it, in the house that was hers, on the land that was theirs, in the life she had built from whatever she'd been given, which had not been much and which had turned out to be exactly enough.